Get your hands where I can see them. Now!
The shout cracked through the air like a gunshot, freezing the world in an instant. Daniel Carter's heart slammed against his ribcage, the panic instinctively seizing his muscles. His mind raced, but he forced himself to move slowly, deliberately, so as not to startle the man with the badge, and the gun pointed in his direction. Daniel's breath came in shallow, controlled bursts as he raised his hands, palms open in a universal gesture of surrender. The sidewalk under his feet felt like a tightrope, one wrong move away from catastrophe. The quiet, sun-soaked neighborhood around him, Brentwood Hills, where he had lived for years, where he walked every day, seemed to vanish, leaving only the suffocating pressure of this moment.
Is there a problem, officer?
Daniel managed to ask, his voice calm, steady. It took everything he had to sound composed, even as adrenaline and fear roared through his veins. The officer, Alex Turner, had his hand hovering near his holster, fingers twitching with barely restrained tension. Alex's blue eyes locked onto Daniel, but there was no recognition, no acknowledgement of shared humanity, just suspicion, a hunger for control. In that heartbeat, Daniel knew that to this man he was not a husband, not a father, not even a neighbor. He was a threat, and that was the part that stung the most, the part that made Daniel's chest tighten with anger, hurt, and the weary, crushing realization that he had been here before, in different places, with different faces, but always the same feeling. The familiar dance of survival, where every move had to be calculated, where every word could tip the scales between safety and disaster. He felt the weight of eyes on him from behind curtains and across yards, neighbors peeking out, their curiosity tinged with judgment. The humiliation burned, but he kept his hands steady, his gaze unflinching.
ID!
Alex barked, the command cutting through Daniel's composure like a jagged knife.
Now!
The humiliation, the injustice of it, threatened to break through. But Daniel couldn't let it. Not here. Not now. Slowly he reached for his wallet, the gesture practiced, almost rehearsed, because men like him always had to think 2 steps ahead, always had to be ready to prove they belonged. And all the while, his mind screamed the same silent prayer it had since he was a teenager. Please don't let this go wrong. Before we dive deeper into this powerful story, take a moment to connect with us. Wherever you are, there's a story unfolding. Give us a glimpse. What's your part of the world like right now? Drop a comment below and let us know. And while you're here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our future stories. We're excited to share this journey with you. The late afternoon sun painted Brentwood Hills in golden hues, casting long shadows over the manicured lawns and pristine driveways. Everything about the scene screamed serenity, from the neatly trimmed hedges to the quiet cul-de-sacs where children played under the watchful eyes of their parents. But to Officer Alex Turner, the stillness was deceptive, a thin veneer that could be shattered by anything or anyone out of place. His patrol car crept down the street, its engine humming softly as he scanned his surroundings. To Alex, this wasn't just a neighborhood, it was his responsibility. His job was to keep it safe, to ensure that nothing disturbed the delicate balance of order and security that the residents had come to expect. His eyes, sharp and scrutinizing, caught every detail, every flicker of movement. That was when he saw him. A tall, muscular black man was walking down the sidewalk, dressed in a simple white t-shirt and jeans. He moved with an air of confidence, unhurried and steady, his head held high. There was nothing outwardly suspicious about him, no furtive glances, no signs of distress. But to Alex, that confidence itself felt like a challenge, a direct affront to his authority. The man didn't belong here. At least that's what Alex's instincts told him. "Who does he think he is?" Alex muttered, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. A rush of adrenaline coursed through his veins, familiar and almost comforting. He'd been on the force long enough to trust his gut, and right now his gut was telling him something was off. His heart beat a little faster, and he felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Years of training had conditioned him to act on instinct, to treat anything unusual as a potential threat. The man seemed to sense Alex's presence. He glanced over at the patrol car, his expression calm and composed, as if he'd anticipated this moment. His gaze met Alex's, steady and unyielding, and something about it made Alex's blood boil. The man's calm demeanor, his lack of fear, it felt wrong, unsettling. Alex slowed the car even further, the engine's low rumble barely masking the pounding of his heartbeat. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, knuckles whitening. The tension between them was palpable, an electric current humming in the air, crackling with anticipation. Daniel walked steadily, but he could feel the weight of Alex's gaze burning into his back, each step more measured as he braced for what might come next. As Alex pulled the car to the curb, his irritation twisted into a tight knot of determination. He adjusted his belt, the handcuffs and baton clinking faintly, a subconscious reminder of his authority. This was his beat, his community to protect, and this man, whoever he was, needed to be checked. He stepped out of the car, adjusting the belt that held his radio, handcuffs, and other tools of authority. His boots crunched against the pavement, the sound punctuating the silence of the street. The man kept walking, seemingly unbothered, and that indifference only fueled Alex's annoyance. He raised his voice, his tone sharp and commanding. "Hey, you there!" The man stopped, his posture relaxed but not complacent. He turned slowly, meeting Alex's gaze head-on. There was something about his expression, unafraid, almost defiant, that made Alex feel a twinge of discomfort, but he quickly buried that feeling under a wave of authority. "Yes, officer," the man said, his voice calm and respectful, but not submissive. It was the kind of voice that didn't waver, that didn't bend under pressure. Alex took a few steps closer, squaring his shoulders. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing. "This is a private neighborhood." The man didn't flinch. He didn't look away or fumble for an excuse. Instead, he took a measured breath, his gaze steady. "I'm just taking a walk," he replied evenly. "I live nearby." Alex's jaw tightened. He didn't like the way this man was looking at him, as if he wasn't intimidated, as if he had every right to be here. "This neighborhood has had reports of suspicious activity," Alex lied, his voice cold. "I need to make sure everything's in order." The man's eyes flickered, a hint of something, frustration perhaps, or resignation, passing over his features. "I haven't done anything wrong," he said. "I'm just taking a walk." But Alex wasn't satisfied. He couldn't be, not when every fiber of his being was telling him that something wasn't right. His eyes swept over the man, cataloging every detail, the relaxed posture, the steady gaze, the casual clothes. Nothing about him screamed danger, but Alex's instincts were on high alert. His hand moved closer to his belt, a subconscious gesture of authority. "Show me some ID," Alex said, his voice brooking no argument. The man's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his composure. "Why?" he asked, his tone still controlled. "Am I being accused of something?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded with meaning. It wasn't just about this moment. It was about all the moments that had come before, all the times men like him had been questioned, judged, and treated as guilty until proven innocent. The man knew this dance all too well, and he wasn't about to let anger get the best of him. Alex felt a flash of irritation. The calm way the man was speaking, the way he didn't back down, it made Alex feel like he was losing control of the situation. And he hated that. Control was everything in his line of work, and right now he felt it slipping through his fingers. "This is a private neighborhood," Alex repeated, his voice growing harsher. "We don't usually see people like you around here. I have the right to question anyone who seems out of place." The man sighed, the sound almost weary. "I live a few blocks over," he said. "I'm not doing anything wrong, just enjoying a walk." But Alex wasn't ready to let it go. His hand hovered near his belt, his fingers twitching. "ID now," he demanded, his tone hard as steel. The man's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, but he didn't resist. Instead, he reached into his pocket, moving slowly and deliberately. He pulled out his wallet and handed over his ID, his gaze never leaving Alex's. Alex snatched it and scanned the information, his eyes narrowing even further. Daniel Carter. The address was indeed local, but Alex's suspicions weren't so easily quelled. "I've never seen you around here before," Alex said, his tone accusatory. "How long have you lived here?" "Several years," Daniel replied, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of irritation now. "I'm usually at work. I don't know what else to tell you." Alex's frustration bubbled to the surface, his grip tightening around the ID. He wasn't used to being questioned, to having his authority challenged. The words, "people like you," had slipped out before he could stop them, and he knew how they sounded, but he doubled down, unwilling to show weakness. Daniel's eyes hardened, but he remained composed. He'd been here before in different places, with different officers. He knew that any hint of anger or defiance could escalate the situation, and he couldn't afford that. Not here, not now. So he stayed still, waiting, his heart pounding. Alex took a step back, clutching the ID like a shield. "Stay right here," he ordered, his voice cracking slightly with tension. He turned and walked back to his patrol car, trying to suppress the unease gnawing at him. This wasn't how he'd imagined his day going. His job was to keep the community safe, but right now he wasn't sure who he was protecting or from what. As Alex sat in his car, the radio crackling, he typed Daniel's details into the system. The seconds ticked by, each one stretching unbearably long. His heart thumped in his chest, and for the first time, a small voice whispered that he might have been wrong. But he pushed that thought aside, clinging to his training, to his sense of duty. Daniel stood on the sidewalk, his breathing steady but his muscles tense. He could feel the eyes of the neighbors on him, peeking through curtains or watching from across the street. A few people whispered, their voices carrying hints of curiosity, fear, or judgment. He'd grown used to this, but it never got easier. One of the neighbors, a woman walking her dog, paused with her phone in hand, ready to record if things took a turn. Daniel caught her eye for a brief moment, but she looked away, uncomfortable. The feeling of being watched, of being judged, settled heavily in his chest. He just wanted to go home, to leave this moment behind, but he knew he had to see it through. Alex's radio crackled to life, and he sat up, gripping the receiver. The dispatcher's voice came through, calm and matter-of-fact. "Turner, background check comes back clean. Local resident, no priors. You're clear." The words hit Alex like a punch to the gut. He'd been wrong. The knot of anger and embarrassment in his stomach twisted painfully. He clenched his jaw, knowing he'd overstepped, knowing there was no way to spin this in his favor. Slowly, Alex climbed out of the patrol car, his face flushed. He walked back to Daniel, who stood waiting, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them thick and suffocating. "Your record's clean," Alex said stiffly, handing back the ID. But his voice lacked the authority it had held before. He felt exposed, like the whole neighborhood was watching and judging him now. Daniel accepted his ID, slipping it back into his wallet. He met Alex's gaze, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Anger, yes, but also exhaustion. A deep, bone-weary tiredness that Alex couldn't begin to understand. "Next time," Daniel said quietly, "maybe think before you assume." Alex's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He turned and walked back to his car, feeling the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. The neighborhood that had once felt familiar and safe now seemed full of eyes, full of whispers he couldn't ignore. As the patrol car drove away, Daniel stood there, his hands trembling slightly. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering fear, the indignity of being treated like a suspect in his own community. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but the sting of the encounter lingered, a wound that refused to heal. He turned and walked home, his steps heavy, his heart aching. He thought of Chloe and Rebecca, of the future he was trying to build for them. And as the shadows grew longer, he wondered if that future was even possible. Daniel's footsteps echoed in his mind long after he'd turned away from Officer Turner. The anger and humiliation coiled in his chest like a living thing, pressing against his ribs with every breath. He walked with his head held high, but each step felt heavier than the last, burdened by memories of similar encounters that never left him. As he rounded the corner and saw his house in the distance, a vision of Chloe's carefree laughter flashed through his mind. It was for her, for the world he wanted her to grow up in, that he kept moving forward, shoulders squared against the storm, weighed down by the silent judgment of onlookers and the burden of having to defend his own innocence. He had done nothing wrong, yet he was made to feel guilty, an unwelcome intruder in his own neighborhood. As he rounded the corner, Daniel tried to let go of the tension, to shake off the familiar cloak of fear and resentment. But it clung to him, a constant reminder of how fragile dignity could be. The sound of his phone buzzing in his pocket startled him, breaking his thoughts. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a text from his wife, Rebecca. "Dinner's almost ready. Hope your walk's going well." He stopped for a moment, taking a deep breath. Rebecca and their daughter, Chloe, were waiting for him at home, blissfully unaware of what had just happened. He could almost hear Chloe's laughter, the sound that filled their house with light even on the darkest days. Daniel wanted to protect that laughter, to shield his family from the ugliness of moments like this. He quickly texted back, "Be home soon." Then with another steadying breath, he resumed his walk. Back at the scene, Officer Alex Turner was still grappling with the aftermath. The whispers of the neighbors cut through him like knives. Some of them hadn't put away their phones, still recording or taking photos. He could feel the weight of their silent judgments pressing down on him. His fellow officer, Pete Martinez, pulled up in another patrol car, his brows furrowed in concern as he approached Alex. "What the hell happened here, Alex?" Pete asked, his voice low. He glanced around at the small crowd that had gathered. "I just heard over the radio that you had a situation." Alex wiped the sweat from his brow, his hand trembling slightly. "It's handled," he replied, but the words came out weaker than he'd intended. The lie tasted bitter on his tongue. He knew Pete could see right through it, and that only made his embarrassment cut deeper. Pete's eyes narrowed. "Handled? It doesn't look handled. You've got people recording you, man. This is bad." Alex's jaw clenched. He knew Pete was right, but he couldn't bear to admit it. He had always prided himself on being in control, on never letting a situation slip through his fingers. But this time, he'd made a mess of things. His badge felt heavy on his chest, a symbol of authority that suddenly felt more like a burden. "I don't need a lecture," Alex snapped, though the defensiveness in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "Just help me disperse the crowd." Pete sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had worked alongside Alex for years and had seen this side of him before, the unyielding pride, the refusal to admit when he was wrong. But this time felt different. The stakes were higher, the implications more serious. "All right," Pete said, his voice resigned. He turned to the onlookers, trying to project calm authority. "Folks, let's clear out. There's nothing more to see here." Reluctantly, the crowd began to dissipate, some murmuring to each other as they went. The tension in the air didn't fade, though. It lingered like a storm cloud, heavy and oppressive. Pete glanced back at Alex, a shadow of disappointment in his eyes. "We'll talk about this later," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Alex didn't respond. He felt the walls closing in, the carefully constructed image of himself as a good cop, a protector, cracking under the weight of his own actions. Meanwhile, Daniel finally reached his house. It was a modest but beautiful home, with a white picket fence and a garden that Rebecca had lovingly tended. Chloe's laughter drifted through the open window, and for a moment Daniel felt the tightness in his chest loosen. This was his sanctuary, the place where he was loved and respected, where he didn't have to prove his worth. As he stepped inside, Chloe ran to him, her curls bouncing and her face alight with joy. "Daddy!" she squealed, throwing her little arms around his legs. "Did you have a good walk?" Daniel knelt down, forcing a smile onto his face as he hugged her. "I did, sweetheart," he said, his voice gentle. "How's my favorite girl?" Chloe giggled, unaware of the shadows lingering in her father's eyes. Rebecca appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, a dish towel in her hands and a knowing look on her face. She could always read Daniel, even when he tried to hide things. "Dinner's ready," she said, but her eyes searched his, silently asking if he was okay. Daniel stood meeting her gaze. He didn't want to burden her with what had happened, not when the evening was supposed to be filled with laughter and warmth. But Rebecca could sense something was wrong. "We'll talk later," he whispered, and she nodded, understanding. Dinner was a lively affair, with Chloe chattering excitedly about her day at preschool. Daniel did his best to engage, to be present, but his mind kept drifting back to the confrontation, to the way Officer Turner had looked at him, with suspicion, with judgment. No matter how many times he faced it, the feeling never got easier. After Chloe was tucked into bed, Daniel and Rebecca sat together in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The weight of the day pressed down on him, heavier than the exhaustion he tried to hide. He rubbed his temples, his voice breaking as he whispered, "How do I explain to her that the world won't always be kind?" Rebecca reached for his hand, her grip firm and grounding. "We'll teach her to be strong," she said, her eyes fierce with determination. "And we'll make the world better for her, step by step." The tears that Daniel had held back all day finally fell, a silent testament to both his fear and his hope. Rebecca reached for his hand, her fingers warm and steady. "What happened?" she asked softly. Daniel's throat tightened. He had always tried to shield her from the ugliness of these encounters, but he couldn't hide it from her now. "I got stopped by a cop," he said, his voice low. "Right in our neighborhood. He thought I didn't belong." Rebecca's eyes widened with hurt and anger. "Again?" she whispered. "After everything? After all we've been through?" Daniel nodded, his jaw clenched. "It never stops, does it?" His voice broke and he looked away, ashamed of the tears that pricked his eyes. He was supposed to be strong, for her, for Chloe, but the constant battles wore him down. Rebecca pulled him into an embrace, her own heart aching for the man she loved. "It's not fair," she said, her voice fierce. "You shouldn't have to prove yourself over and over again." Daniel held her close, letting her warmth seep into his bones. "I'm tired, Rebecca," he admitted. "So damn tired." They sat there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, as the world outside continued its relentless march. But inside that house, there was love, there was strength, and there was a determination to keep fighting, no matter how heavy the burden. At the Brentwood police station, the atmosphere was tense. Officer Turner sat in a small, sterile room, his head in his hands. The walls felt like they were closing in, and for the first time, he began to question everything he had done. His superior, Sergeant Laura Mitchell, entered the room, her expression unreadable. "Alex," she said, her voice calm but firm, "we need to talk." He looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of defiance and shame. "I was just doing my job," he said, but the words sounded hollow, even to him. Laura crossed her arms, her gaze piercing. "Your job is to protect and serve," she said, "not to judge people based on how they look." The words hit Alex like a blow. He opened his mouth to argue, but the images of what had happened replayed in his mind. Daniel's calm defiance, the crowd's whispers, Pete's disappointment. It all added up to a picture he didn't want to face, a truth he didn't want to admit. Laura leaned forward, her voice low and serious. "This isn't just about you, Alex. It's about the trust between this department and the community. And right now, you've jeopardized that trust." He swallowed hard, the weight of his actions finally crashing over him. "What do you want me to do?" he whispered. Laura's eyes softened, but only slightly. "You need to own up to your mistake," she said. "And you need to start listening, really listening, to the people you're supposed to protect." Alex didn't respond. He couldn't. All he could do was sit there, the realization sinking in that maybe he wasn't the hero he had always imagined himself to be. The morning sun crept over the horizon, casting long golden beams across Brentwood Hills, but the beauty of the day did little to lift the heaviness that had settled over Daniel's heart. He stood in the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee, the steam curling upward like a restless spirit. His hands were steady, but his mind raced with echoes of yesterday's confrontation. Rebecca entered the kitchen, still in her pajamas, her hair slightly disheveled. She leaned against the counter, studying Daniel. "You barely slept," she said, her voice soft with concern. Daniel managed a small, tired smile. "I'm okay," he lied. But the truth was, the weight of what had happened lingered, pressing down on him with an almost physical force. He had spent so many years trying to keep his family safe, to shield them from the ugliness of the world. But how could he protect them when he couldn't even take a walk in his own neighborhood without being treated like a criminal? Rebecca crossed the distance between them, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "You don't have to pretend with me," she whispered. Daniel's shoulders sagged, the facade of strength crumbling just a little. He set the coffee mug down, taking a deep breath. I hate that this is our reality, he said. That no matter how much I achieve, how hard I work, I'm still seen as a threat. Rebecca's eyes filled with unshed tears, but she held them back. She knew that her husband needed her strength more than her sorrow. You are not a threat, she said firmly. You're an incredible man, an amazing father. Don't let one ignorant cop make you forget that. Daniel pulled her into his arms, holding her close. Her words were a balm to the wounds left by years of microaggressions and overt prejudice. But the scars ran deep. He knew that his family's love couldn't erase the world's cruelty, but it was enough to keep him going, at least for now. Meanwhile, at the Brentwood police station, Officer Alex Turner sat in a mandatory sensitivity training session. His jaw clenched so tightly it ached. The small, cramped room felt suffocating, made worse by the uncomfortable silence of officers who shared his reluctance. As the instructor spoke about implicit bias, Alex's mind drifted back to Daniel Carter's steady, unyielding gaze. The memory gnawed at him, each word from the instructor chipping away at the certainty he'd once held about his own impartiality. His stomach twisted with doubt, and for the first time, he wondered if protecting the community had really been his true motivation, or if he had been protecting something far more fragile, his own sense of power. An instructor stood at the front, her voice calm but firm as she outlined the day's agenda: implicit bias, racial profiling, and the impact of police behavior on community trust. Alex shifted in his seat, his mind drifting. He didn't think he needed to be here. Sure, he'd made a mistake, but he had been doing his job, hadn't he? Protecting the community, maintaining order. That's what he had sworn to do. And yet a small, nagging voice whispered in the back of his mind, asking if his actions had really been about protection or about something else. Officer Turner, the instructor called, pulling him back to the present. Her eyes locked onto his, and he felt an uncomfortable heat rise in his face. What are your thoughts on how biases might affect your work? Alex's throat went dry. He hated feeling put on the spot, especially in front of his peers. I think we all have biases, he said, his voice tight. But that doesn't mean we act on them. The instructor raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. Studies have shown that even well-meaning officers can let their biases influence their decisions, she said. Recognizing that is the first step toward change. Alex wanted to argue, to insist that he wasn't one of those officers. But the memory of Daniel Carter's calm, unyielding eyes haunted him. He shifted uncomfortably, the seed of doubt growing. Daniel, meanwhile, had a meeting he couldn't avoid. He arrived at the local community center, a building he knew well from years of volunteering. Today, though, he wasn't here to organize a charity event or coach a youth sports team. He was here to meet with community leaders and discuss what had happened. His presence was more than just a personal matter now. It had become a catalyst for a larger conversation about safety, trust, and equality. The meeting room was filled with familiar faces. Mrs. Turner, an elderly activist who had spent decades fighting for civil rights. Jordan Reynolds, a young community organizer with a fire in his eyes. And Father Thomas, the local pastor whose voice carried both authority and compassion. They all looked at Daniel with a mix of support and expectation. Mrs. Turner was the first to speak. "Daniel," she said, her voice strong despite her years, "we heard about what happened. We're here to stand with you, but we need to know, how do you want to move forward?" Daniel took a moment to gather his thoughts. He had always been a man of action, not words, but today he had to speak. "We can't keep letting this happen," he said, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "We have to hold the police accountable, but we also need to educate them. They need to see us as neighbors, not threats." Jordan leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "What about a town hall?" he suggested. "We bring the police and the community together, have an open dialogue, make them understand the damage they're doing." Father Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Dialogue is a start," he said, "but we need to make sure it leads to real change. Otherwise, it's just words." The room buzzed with agreement, but Daniel knew that words, even well-meaning ones, often fell short. He thought of Chloe, of the world he wanted her to grow up in, a world where she wouldn't have to carry the same burdens he did. "Then let's do it," he said, determination hardening his voice. "Let's hold them accountable, And let's make sure this doesn't become just another story that gets forgotten. Back at the police station, Sergeant Laura Mitchell watched Alex Turner from her office window. She had always prided herself on leading a force that respected the community, but lately she had seen cracks in that image. She knew Alex wasn't a bad person, but he had let his fear and prejudice get the better of him. And it wasn't just Alex. There were deeper issues within the department that needed to be addressed. Laura walked into the training session, interrupting the instructor. "Officer Turner," she called, her voice clear and commanding. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" Alex's heart sank, but he stood, following Laura out into the hallway. The tension between them was palpable. Laura crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Do you understand what's at stake here?" she asked. "This isn't just about you. It's about the entire department, about the trust we're supposed to build with the people we serve." Alex swallowed hard. I know I made a mistake," he admitted, the words feeling foreign and heavy in his mouth. "But I thought I was protecting the community." Laura's eyes softened, but only slightly. "Protection isn't about power, Alex," she said. "It's about respect. It's about listening. You let your fear guide you, and now we have to repair the damage." For the first time, Alex felt a crack in his defenses. He thought of Daniel's eyes, the quiet strength in his voice, and the way he had walked away, carrying a burden that Alex had placed on him. Shame twisted in his gut. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice small. Laura sighed. "You start by listening. There's going to be a town hall meeting. You're going to attend, and you're going to hear what the community has to say. Maybe then you'll understand." Alex nodded, but the fear of what he might hear, of facing the consequences of his actions, gnawed at him. The day of the town hall meeting arrived, and the community center buzzed with tension. Residents of Brentwood Hills packed the room, some sitting in chairs, others standing against the walls. The air was thick with anticipation, a mixture of hope and skepticism. Daniel stood at the front, his heart pounding. He had prepared for this, but the weight of what he was about to do felt immense. Rebecca sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Chloe was at home with a neighbor, blissfully unaware of the storm her father was walking into. Daniel drew strength from the thought of her, from the future he wanted to build for her. The police officers filed in, their uniforms crisp, but their faces uneasy. Alex was among them, his gaze fixed on the floor. Laura stood beside him, her posture firm, ready to lead but also ready to listen. Mrs. Turner was the first to speak, her voice carrying the wisdom of years of struggle. "We're not here to attack anyone," she said. "We're here to have a conversation, but it needs to be an honest one." Daniel stepped forward, his throat dry but his resolve unwavering. "I'm not here to point fingers," he began, "but I need you to understand what it feels like to be treated like a criminal in your own home, to be judged not by your actions, but by the color of your skin." The room fell silent, every word hanging in the air like a challenge. Alex felt his stomach twist, guilt and shame warring inside him. He had come here to listen, but he hadn't expected to feel so exposed, so vulnerable. Jordan took the mic next, his voice filled with passion. "We deserve to feel safe, just like everyone else in this neighborhood," he said. "And that safety starts with trust. How can we trust you if you don't see us as equals?" The officers shifted uncomfortably, some nodding, others looking away. The conversation continued, voices rising and falling, emotions raw and unfiltered. Stories were shared, tears were shed, and the weight of years of pain and mistrust filled the room. Laura watched Alex, hoping he was listening, really listening. She knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but it had to start somewhere. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning. The room was filled with a tense, expectant silence, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Daniel Carter stood at the front, his heart pounding in his chest. He had always been composed, always maintained his calm in the face of adversity, but today was different. Today he was bearing his soul to a room full of neighbors, friends, and officers who had the power to shape his future, and Chloe's. He looked out at the crowd, at the familiar faces that he'd seen at school fundraisers, community barbecues, and Sunday services. But today, those faces were marked with a mixture of hope, fear, and in some cases, resentment. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. "I moved here," Daniel began, his voice steady but filled with raw emotion, "because I wanted a safe, loving community for my family. My wife and I worked hard, saved every penny, to buy a house in a neighborhood where our daughter could grow up feeling secure. But yesterday, when I was stopped and treated like a criminal, it reminded me that safety is a privilege not everyone in this room can take for granted." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned in, hanging on to every word. The officers stood at the back, their faces stoic, but even they couldn't hide the discomfort Daniel's words brought to the surface. "My daughter, Chloe," Daniel continued, his voice thick with emotion, "deserves to grow up believing she belongs. She shouldn't have to carry the weight of proving her worth to people who don't even know her. She shouldn't have to see her father treated like he doesn't matter." A woman in the audience, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, reached for her husband's hand. Daniel's words struck a deep, painful chord, exposing the reality that many had ignored or chosen not to see. Alex Turner stood at the back, feeling every word like a punch to the gut. He remembered the little girl he had seen in Daniel's family photo during the background check, her smile wide and innocent. The realization of the damage he had caused hit him with a force that made his knees weak. He had thought he was protecting the community, but he was beginning to understand that he had been protecting only a narrow, misguided version of it. Father Thomas, the local pastor, stepped forward, his presence calming yet resolute. "Thank you for sharing your story, Daniel," he said. "We are all here because we want to be better neighbors, better protectors, and better allies. But change requires more than words. It requires action." The crowd murmured in agreement. Jordan Reynolds, the young activist, took the microphone next. His voice was filled with a fire that couldn't be extinguished. "We've heard stories like Daniel's too many times," he said. "But hearing isn't enough. We need policies that prevent this kind of profiling. We need accountability, transparency, and a real commitment to change." Laura Mitchell, standing beside Alex, felt a pang of pride mixed with sorrow. She had seen the best and the worst of law enforcement, and she knew that today was about more than just one officer's mistake. It was about dismantling a culture that had allowed prejudice to fester unchecked. "I know that many of you are angry," Laura said, stepping forward, "and you have every right to be. As a department, we've failed you. We've failed to live up to the promise of protecting and serving every member of this community equally. But we're here because we want to listen and to learn. We need your voices, your experiences, to guide us." Alex felt the eyes of the room turn toward him. He could feel the heat rising in his face, the shame wrapping around him like a vice. This was his moment, to hide from the truth or face it head on. He took a shaky breath, his hands trembling at his sides, and stepped forward. I know that saying "I'm sorry" doesn't change what I did," Alex began, his voice cracking. "Yesterday, I let my fear and my biases control me, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. I didn't see Daniel as a neighbor, as a father, as a man who has every right to be here, and for that, I'm truly sorry." Daniel's eyes met Alex's, and for a moment the room felt frozen in time. The apology hung in the air, raw and unvarnished. But Daniel knew that words, however sincere, could never fully heal the wounds left behind. He nodded, acknowledging the apology, but not yet ready to forgive. Forgiveness was a process, one that required more than a moment of contrition. Jordan stepped in, his voice sharp but measured. "Apologies are a start, but they mean nothing without action. What are you, as a department, going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again?" Laura nodded, her expression resolute. "We're implementing new training programs focused on racial sensitivity and de-escalation. But more importantly, we're establishing an independent review board made up of community members. They'll have the authority to investigate complaints and hold officers accountable." The room erupted in a mixture of surprise and cautious optimism. This was a step forward, but many wondered if it would be enough. That evening, Daniel returned home, emotionally drained but hopeful. Rebecca was waiting for him, her face a mixture of anxiety and pride. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice soft. Daniel sank into the couch beside her, running a hand through his hair. "It was hard," he admitted, "but it felt necessary. Like maybe, just maybe, we can start to change things. Rebecca leaned her head on his shoulder, her own heart aching from the weight he carried. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "You stood up not just for us, but for every family who has ever felt the way we have." Daniel kissed the top of her head, holding her close. "I hope it makes a difference," he said. "For Chloe, for everyone." Chloe bounded into the room, her face lighting up when she saw her father. "Daddy, can we play now?" she asked, her voice full of joy, unaware of the battles her parents fought to give her this innocence. Daniel smiled, feeling his heart swell with love. "Of course, sweetheart," he said, scooping her up in his arms. In that moment, the weight he carried felt a little lighter, softened by the love of his family. Days turned into weeks, and the ripple effects of the town hall meeting spread throughout Brentwood Hills. Conversations that had once been whispered in private were now being had openly, and the community began to grapple with the reality of its own prejudices. The police department started implementing the promised changes. Officers attended workshops led by community members who shared their stories, their pain, and their hopes. The sessions were uncomfortable, raw, and often tearful, but they were necessary. Each story chipped away at the walls of indifference that had been built over years. Alex Turner was among those who struggled the most. The weight of his actions stayed with him, haunting him in the quiet moments. He threw himself into the training, but guilt clung to him like a second skin. One day, after a particularly grueling session, he found himself sitting alone in his patrol car, staring at a photo of his own family. "Daddy, can we go to the park today?" his son had asked that morning, his eyes full of innocent excitement. Alex's heart clenched at the thought of his son growing up in a world where prejudice could touch him too. He knew he had to do better, for his son, for Daniel, for the entire community. Meanwhile, Daniel found himself stepping into a new role. He became a voice for change, invited to speak at schools, community centers, and even city council meetings. Each speech took a piece of his heart, but he gave it willingly, hoping that his vulnerability would spark something meaningful. One afternoon, as he finished speaking at Chloe's school, a young boy approached him, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Mr. Carter," the boy said, clutching a notebook to his chest, "do you think things will really get better?" Daniel knelt down, meeting the boy's gaze. He thought of Chloe, of the world he wanted for her, and took a steadying breath. "I hope so," he said gently. "But it takes all of us working together to make it better. We have to care enough to fight for each other." The boy nodded, his eyes shining with newfound determination. Daniel felt a flicker of hope. Change was slow, painfully so, but it was happening. One conversation, one moment of understanding, at a time. The community of Brentwood Hills continued to grow, to wrestle with its past and strive for a better future. It wasn't easy, and there were setbacks along the way, but the seeds of change had been planted, and they were beginning to take root. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Daniel found himself walking the same path he had taken the day Officer Turner had stopped him. The leaves crunched underfoot, the air crisp and clean. This time, when he passed a patrol car, the officer inside, Alex Turner, nodded to him, a gesture of respect and understanding. Daniel nodded back, a small but significant acknowledgement. They were both learning, both trying to do better, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt a sense of cautious hope. The road ahead was long, but he was willing to walk it, step by step, with his head held high. The fight for justice, for belonging, for the simple right to exist without fear, was far from over. But with every voice that spoke up, every heart that chose compassion over fear, they were moving forward. And that, Daniel thought, was worth everything. Chapter 5. A Conversation for Change. The crisp air of a late autumn evening filled the community center as people filtered in, their faces illuminated by the soft, warm glow of the overhead lights. The room buzzed with anticipation, a mix of hope and trepidation. This was more than just a meeting. It was a chance for healing, a step toward bridging divides that had festered for far too long. Daniel Carter stood near the front, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, yet his heart still raced with nervous energy. He glanced over at Rebecca, who offered him a small, reassuring smile. Her presence anchored him, reminded him of why he was here. for Chloe, for their family, for a better future. As more residents of Brentwood Hills filed into the room, the police officers took their places along the back wall. Their blue uniforms stood in stark contrast to the casual clothes of the community members, a visual reminder of the power dynamic that had long gone unexamined. Among the officers was Alex Turner, his face pale but resolute. He had dreaded this evening, but he knew he had to be here, to listen, to face the consequences of his actions. Father Thomas stepped up to the podium, his voice strong and clear, but tinged with the weight of a man who had seen too much pain in his congregation. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "We're here tonight to listen, to understand, and to find a path forward together. We can't change the past, but we can shape the future." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd, and gestured for Daniel to come forward. Daniel took a breath, feeling the room's collective gaze settle on him. He stepped up to the microphone, his palms damp with nerves, but his voice steady. "Thank you," he began, his tone calm but powerful. "I want to start by saying that I'm not here to point fingers or to deepen divides. I'm here because I believe in this community. I believe that we can be better, that we have to be better, for each other, for our children." His eyes swept over the room, meeting the gazes of neighbors he knew well and some he barely recognized. "When I was stopped by Officer Turner," he continued, "I felt something that I know many of you understand, the feeling of being judged for something you can't change, the feeling of being seen as a threat when all you want is to belong." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Daniel let the weight of his words settle. "I moved to Brentwood Hills because I wanted a safe place for my family. But safety should never come at the expense of someone else's humanity. We have to ask ourselves, what kind of community do we want to be?" Alex Turner swallowed hard, his heart thudding in his chest. Each word pierced through the defenses he had built around himself, forcing him to confront the reality he had tried to ignore. He had come here prepared to listen, but he hadn't expected the truth to hurt this much. Jordan Reynolds, the young activist, stepped up next. His voice was fierce, carrying the urgency of a generation tired of waiting for change. "We've had too many meetings, too many promises with no follow-through," he said, his eyes flashing with determination. "It's time for real action. We need policies that protect us, not just words that make us feel better for a moment." The tension in the room thickened, a palpable reminder of the pain and frustration that had accumulated over the years. But it was Father Thomas who stepped forward once more, his presence a calming influence. "We must remember that change is not easy," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But it is necessary. It will take all of us, working together, listening to each other, and holding each other accountable." The evening wore on, filled with stories that broke hearts and stories that inspired hope. Mrs. Turner, the elderly activist, shared her memories of fighting for civil rights in the 1960s, her voice quivering with emotion. "I never thought," she said, her eyes glistening with tears, "that I would still be fighting the same battles all these years later. But I have hope because I see young people like you, Daniel, standing up for what's right." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat, but he swallowed it down, nodding respectfully. Her words were a reminder of the long road they still had to walk, but also of the progress they had made. As the meeting began to wind down, Laura Mitchell stepped up to the microphone, her expression solemn but determined. "I want to address the promises we're making tonight," she said. "We are committed to implementing an independent review board made up of community members. We're committed to revising our training programs and ensuring that every officer understands the importance of cultural sensitivity and de-escalation." Her voice grew stronger, filled with conviction. "But I also want to acknowledge that trust is not rebuilt overnight. It's earned through action, through humility, and through accountability. We owe you that, and we will work every day to earn back the trust we've lost." The room erupted into a mix of applause and murmurs of approval. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start, a step toward a future where everyone could feel seen and heard. As people began to file out of the community center, Daniel felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Alex Turner standing there, his expression raw with vulnerability. "Daniel," Alex said, his voice low and unsteady, "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I'm committed to doing better. I'm trying to understand, to change. Daniel studied him for a moment, his own emotions a tangled web of anger, exhaustion, and a small, flickering hope. Change doesn't happen just because we want it to, he replied. It happens when we're willing to do the hard work. Alex nodded, the weight of Daniel's words settling on him like a heavy but necessary burden. I know, he said quietly, and I'm willing. The two men stood there, an uneasy truce forming between them. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start, a fragile bridge over a chasm that had existed for far too long. Over the next few weeks, the promises made at the town hall began to take shape. The Independent Review Board held its first meeting, and community members were invited to share their experiences and offer suggestions. The police department, under Laura Mitchell's leadership, began implementing mandatory workshops that went beyond basic training, diving into the systemic issues that had long plagued their ranks. One of those workshops was led by a woman named Tamika Johnson, a social worker who specialized in restorative justice. She stood in front of a room full of officers, her voice unwavering as she shared her own encounters with prejudice and discrimination. Understanding bias, she said, isn't about blaming. It's about acknowledging the systems we've all been a part of and finding ways to do better. Alex sat in the front row, his notebook open, but he found himself struggling to write. Each story Tamika told felt like a mirror, reflecting parts of himself he didn't want to see. He had joined the force to protect people, to make a difference, but somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of what that really meant. Tamika paused, looking around the room. I'm not here to make you feel guilty, she said, her voice softening. I'm here to remind you that you have the power to change lives, for better or for worse. What you choose to do with that power matters. The words settled heavily on Alex's heart. He thought of his own son, the future he wanted to build for him, a future where his son wouldn't have to live in fear, wouldn't have to prove his worth to anyone. It was a future worth fighting for, even if it meant confronting his own shortcomings. Meanwhile, Daniel found himself busier than ever. His days were filled with meetings, speeches, and advocacy work, but he also made time for his family. He took Chloe to the park, taught her how to ride her bike, and tried to hold on to the small moments that made life beautiful. One afternoon, as he sat on a park bench watching Chloe play, he was approached by a young mother named Lindsay Parker. Her son was playing alongside Chloe, and she offered Daniel a tentative smile. I just wanted to say thank you, she said, her voice hesitant. For speaking up, for doing what you're doing. It's making a difference. Daniel was taken aback, but he nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. That means a lot. Lindsay's eyes welled up with tears. I grew up here, she admitted. And I used to think that racism was something that only happened in other places, not in my community. But hearing your story made me realize how blind I've been. I'm trying to teach my son to be better. Daniel reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. We're all learning, he said. The important thing is that we're trying. As Chloe ran up to him, her face flushed with happiness, Daniel lifted her into his arms. He felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, but he also felt the strength of the community that was beginning to come together. It was a long road, but for the first time in a while, he felt hopeful. In the months that followed, the community of Brentwood Hills continued to grow and change. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of pain and conflict, but there was also a renewed sense of purpose. Neighbors who had once ignored each other now exchanged smiles and conversations. Police officers, who had once patrolled with suspicion, now worked to build relationships with the people they served. Alex Turner became one of the most vocal advocates for change within the department. He organized volunteer events, joined community projects, and even invited Daniel to speak to the officers about his experiences. It wasn't easy, and he knew he still had a long way to go, but he was committed to the journey. One evening, as Daniel and Alex stood side by side at a community cleanup event, they shared a quiet moment of reflection. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the neighborhood they both called home. Do you think we'll ever really get there? Alex asked, his voice filled with equal parts hope and doubt. Daniel thought for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. I don't know, he admitted, but we're closer today than we were yesterday, And that's something. Alex nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Yeah, he said softly. It is. And as the evening light faded, the two men stood there, two unlikely allies in a fight that was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, they stood on common ground, ready to keep moving forward. The early morning sun cast a golden hue over Brentwood Hills, its light filtering through the trees and illuminating the streets below. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of fallen leaves, and the world felt alive with the promise of a new day. For Daniel Carter, the morning held a sense of renewal, but it also carried the weight of everything that had come before. He stood in his front yard, a rake in hand, as he gathered leaves into neat piles. The mundane task gave him a moment of quiet, a reprieve from the whirlwind of the past few months. As he worked, he reflected on how the neighborhood had changed, and how he had changed along with it. Rebecca stepped out onto the porch, two steaming mugs of coffee in her hands. She approached Daniel with a smile that was both warm and knowing. "Morning," she said, handing him a mug. Daniel accepted it gratefully, taking a sip and savoring the warmth that spread through his chest. "Morning," he replied, his voice soft but filled with gratitude. They stood together for a moment, watching the world around them come to life. Children's laughter echoed from nearby yards, and neighbors exchanged greetings as they walked their dogs or jogged along the sidewalks. Chloe's voice rang out from the side yard, where she was playing with a group of friends. Her laughter was like music, a reminder of the innocence they were fighting to protect. Daniel's heart swelled with love for his daughter, but it was also tinged with a familiar ache, the knowledge that he couldn't shield her from everything. Rebecca sensed his mood and placed a comforting hand on his arm. "You've done so much," she said, her voice steady. "Not just for us, but for this whole community." Daniel set his mug down and took her hand in his. "We've done it together," he said. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Their moment of quiet was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up to the curb. Daniel turned to see a familiar patrol car, though today it didn't fill him with the dread it once had. The door opened, and Officer Alex Turner stepped out, dressed in plain clothes and carrying a large covered dish. Alex approached the Carters with a nervous but determined expression. "Hey, Daniel, Rebecca," he said, nodding at each of them. I hope I'm not interrupting." Daniel and Rebecca exchanged a glance before Daniel smiled and gestured for Alex to come closer. "Not at all," he said. "What brings you by?" Alex set the dish down on a small patio table and rubbed the back of his neck. "The department is hosting a community potluck today," he explained. "We figured it'd be a good way to bring everyone together, outside of meetings and workshops." He lifted the dish slightly. "I made lasagna, my mom's recipe." Rebecca's eyes lit up with pleasant surprise. "Lasagna? Now you're speaking my language," she said, laughing. The sound eased some of the tension hanging in the air. "That's really thoughtful, Alex." "Thank you." Alex's shoulders relaxed, and a small, genuine smile spread across his face. "I'm trying," he admitted. "We all are." Daniel studied him for a moment, seeing the sincerity in his expression. The journey from that tense day on the sidewalk to this moment had been long and painful, but it had also been transformative. Forgiveness was a complicated thing, and while Daniel wasn't sure he was ready to fully forgive, he knew that healing had to start somewhere. "Thank you for coming," Daniel said, his voice sincere. He extended a hand and Alex took it, their handshake firm and genuine. The community potluck was held at Brentwood Park under the canopy of ancient oaks whose branches swayed gently in the breeze. Tables were arranged in long rows, covered with colorful tablecloths and laden with dishes of every kind. The aroma of home-cooked meals mingled with the scent of autumn, and the air was filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation. Families gathered, children played, and neighbors who had once been strangers were now sharing meals and stories. The potluck wasn't just a social event, it was a testament to the power of community and the strength of people coming together to heal and grow. Daniel and Rebecca arrived with Chloe, carrying a tray of Rebecca's famous fried chicken. Chloe ran off to join her friends, her laughter echoing across the park, while Daniel and Rebecca made their way to one of the tables. They were greeted with smiles and warm handshakes, a far cry from the wary stares that had once greeted them. Sergeant Laura Mitchell stood near the front, talking animatedly with Tamika Johnson, the social worker who had been instrumental in leading the police department's new training initiatives. Laura caught Daniel's eye and gave him a nod of acknowledgement, a silent promise that the work they had started would continue. Father Thomas stepped up to a makeshift stage where a microphone had been set up. He clapped his hands to get everyone's attention, and the crowd gradually quieted. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice warm and welcoming. "Today is about more than just food and fellowship. It's about celebrating the progress we've made and committing to the work that still lies ahead." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd, before gesturing for Daniel to come forward. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment, and stepped up to the microphone. The faces of his friends, neighbors, and even former adversaries looked back at him, a tapestry of hope and resilience. "When I first moved to Brentwood Hills," Daniel began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "I dreamed of a place where my family could thrive, where my daughter could grow up feeling safe and loved. But as many of you know, that dream wasn't always a reality." He glanced at Chloe, who was playing nearby, and his voice softened. "I've faced challenges, but I've also witnessed incredible kindness and strength from this community. We've come together in ways I never imagined, and for that, I'm grateful. But gratitude doesn't mean our work is done. We have to keep pushing for change, for understanding, and for a future where everyone feels they belong." Applause erupted, and Daniel felt a surge of hope. He stepped back, letting the next speaker take the stage, but he knew this moment would stay with him. The journey was far from over, but today they were celebrating how far they'd come. As the day unfolded, Daniel found himself talking to neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years. He shared laughs with old friends, listened to stories from newcomers, and felt the fabric of the community stitching itself back together. Alex Turner, no longer hiding at the edges of the crowd, joined in the festivities. He spoke with Tamika and other community leaders, listening to their stories and learning from their experiences. He was no longer the officer who had stood in judgment. He was now a man trying to understand, to grow, and to make amends. Tamika watched him with a thoughtful expression. She approached Daniel later in the afternoon, her smile warm but knowing. "People can change," she said, nodding toward Alex. "It's not easy, and it's not always linear, but it's possible." Daniel followed her gaze, seeing Alex laugh at a joke one of the kids had made. "Yeah," he agreed, his voice contemplative. "It is." Tamika placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've inspired a lot of that change, she said. "Your willingness to share your story, to stand up for what's right, it's made a difference." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat, but he swallowed it down. "I just did what I had to do," he said. "For Chloe, for all of us." Tamika squeezed his shoulder. "And that's exactly why it mattered." As evening fell and the sky turned shades of pink and orange, the potluck wound down. The tables were being cleared, and families packed up their dishes, but no one seemed eager to leave. The sense of unity and hope lingered, a gentle hum that filled the air. Daniel and Alex found themselves standing side by side near the edge of the park, watching the sunset. It was a moment heavy with unspoken truths, but also one filled with quiet understanding. "I never really thanked you," Alex said, breaking the silence. His voice was raw but genuine. "Not just for today, but for pushing me to see things I didn't want to see." Daniel turned to him, a contemplative look in his eyes. "It's not about thanking me," he replied. "It's about making sure we don't go back to the way things were." Alex nodded, the weight of his words settling deep in his heart. "I'm committed to that," he said, "to making sure we do better." They stood in silence for a moment longer, watching as the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a beginning, a fragile but hopeful beginning. That night, Daniel and Rebecca sat on their front porch, the stars twinkling above them. Chloe had fallen asleep hours ago, exhausted from the day's excitement, and the house was quiet. Daniel leaned back in his chair, a sense of peace settling over him. Rebecca reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "You did good today," she said, her voice filled with pride. Daniel looked at her, his heart swelling with love. "We did good," he corrected. Together, they sat in companionable silence, listening to the rustle of the leaves and the distant sound of an owl hooting. The road ahead was still long, filled with challenges they couldn't yet see. But for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt ready to face it. He had fought for his family, for his community, and for a future he could believe in. And while the journey was far from over, he knew they were on the right path step by step, day by day, together. As the night deepened and the world around them quieted, Daniel held on to that hope, knowing that it was the most powerful thing they had. The fight for justice, for belonging, for a world where everyone could walk freely without fear, was far from over. But it was a fight worth fighting, and he was ready. And so, under the vast expanse of stars, Brentwood Hills settled into a new kind of peace, a peace built on understanding, on love, and on the promise of a brighter tomorrow. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and open the mind. Until next time, remember, every story has the power to make a difference, yours included.